Hello, Brubs. We're back with the poet Edgar Allan Poe, Alien Angel by Jerome McGann. Chapter 1. We shall use the baby again. Use the baby feet again. See if I can get this open. Poe in Propria Persona. Cleopatra, it were for me to throw my scepter at the injurious gods, to tell them that this world did equal theirs, till they had stolen our jewel. All's but naught. Patience is sottish, and impatience does become a dog that's mad. Then is it sin to rush into the secret house of death, or death dare come to us? Shakespeare, Antony, and Cleopatra. The American poet and critic E.C. Stedman once asked Swinburne to give a brief account of himself. Swinburne replied that knowing as you do the dates and sequence of my published books, you know every event of my life. In fact, of course, a biography of Swinburne's life would hold anyone's interest, though its gravitational field will always be his remarkable literary and cultural career. What do you got, bruv? Poe's life, however, is different, as is clear from the unabating flood of biographical work, popular and scholarly, that keeps trying to wrestle it to earth. Poe's writings are deeply meshed with his life, more meshed even than Swinburne's, for the brilliant English poet did not spend himself as Poe did, working in literary trenches and often in trench warfare. Swinburne fought at Salamis, Poe at Verdun. I don't know how to say either of those. Poe's life is thus fraught with misery and the chaos of misfortune, more painful exactly because so relentlessly quotidian. As such, his life throws up obstacles to a clear view of the work and its significance, which is very great, as even Eliot was reluctantly forced to insist. And yet the life, taxed and agitated though it was, must be brought to bear. But if we want a clear view of the work rather than the man, and in particular of the poetry, which is the focus of this book, we need to step back from the clamor of Poe's driven American world, so energetic and sordid, bound for hope and glory, and everywhere bound as well by illusions, lies, betrayal, and self betrayals. I say step back not to set those matters aside, nor to discount their importance, however, as the last section of this study shows. I want to step back to gain a critical perspective that might escape strangulation by the various narratives that have been laid over that legend laden life. Poe's work, like his life, does not shape itself to that critical form so much in current vogue, a trajectory. Even his death was, in narrative terms, incoherent. Indeed, biography struggles with his career because Poe's life is so bizarre, at once driven and helplessly disordered. Few poets' lives are as painful to read as Poe's. Those life conditions make a clear view of Poe's work very difficult. The explanatory frameworks that biographers pursue, the many myths of Poe's life, are efforts to discover an order in the extreme disorder of his life and world. In doing this, they distract us from the work itself. What is far worse, however, they create an assumption that the work is confused as well. In Lowell's notorious remark, 3/5 genius and 2/5 sheer fudge. Poe's work thus often comes before us, as if it were in desperate need of an enlightened interpreter or the steady hand of critical judgment. In those circumstances, we want a map for the work that depends less on Poe's life stories and myths, and important as they are, than on the life documents that stand behind those narratives. A documentary orientation, the basis of all biography, helps to blunt the preemptive interpretational drive that biography, or history for that matter, introduces into any study of cultural materials. It helps to isolate the works as such and so concentrate our critical attention. Paradoxically, the historical importance and originality of Poe's work will, I believe, come into sharper focus as a result. More than that, a documentary approach can help us see that the critical integrity of the work is responding to the territory's discontinuous character. An ordnance survey map is less useful for locating Poe's works in its historical context than a topological space, with basins of order shifting under the force of arbitrary and strange attractors. As to such a critical method, the analogy would be to a cubist or action painting, or perhaps even better, given Poe's storytelling interests, to the multi-perspectival pictures of an artist like Christopher Derek Bruno. To that end, I begin with a set of documents of recognized importance. Their chronology is inconsequent to my concerns, except where they show internal revisions. Only slightly less inconsequent, in a general sense, is the order in which these documents will be examined. Not that my arrangement is undeliberate, but I can imagine someone else examining them in a different order, as I can imagine someone else choosing another set, perhaps with some overlaps. My sequence reflects a long struggle to see Poe's poetry steadily and to see it whole. An angel of the odd hovers over Poe's work, not least in the mysteries that leak from and then haunt textual details that often seem too trivial to command close attention. Why does Israfel's music come from unusual strings? Such a pedestrian and colloquial word. Or why is the dream vision of the sleeper located in the universal valley, my italics? What did Poe mean when he told James Russell Lowell, "At death the worm is the butterfly"? Had he written "becomes the butterfly," we would have sailed right past that sentence. Or how does one pronounce porphyrogen, I can't say it. Knowing Poe's conviction that a passionate poem is a contradiction in terms, Marginalia, December 1844, what are we to make of Israfel's contempt for an unimpassioned song, or given the explicit theatrical setting of the conqueror worm, did Poe intend to pun with the phrase condor wings? And if so, why condor? In general, if we say, following Poe's lead, that these texts are meant to be what Poe repeatedly calls suggestive, is that judgment critically sufficient? And if not, where does the insufficiency lie? In Poe, in us? I've come to believe that the insufficiency has largely been ours, or mine. What follows is an effort to make it up. The effort is a great part inspired by T.S. Eliot's lifelong struggle to understand what Whitman, radically revising his own earlier negative judgment of Poe, called Edgar Poe's significance. Eliot never doubted Poe's enormous cultural significance. How could he, given the importance of Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and Valery for Eliot's work and view of modern culture? At the same time, he wondered how anyone could not judge the poetry slipshod, puerile, and without perfection in any detail. From Poe to Valery. He did not himself make those judgments. He was joining his voice to an influential line of English and American reading. But his assent left him dissatisfied because he recognized that Poe was the master spirit of an important modern tradition, for Eliot, the most important tradition. I suspect as well that the author of Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, a piece of garbage book, spent a lifetime outgrowing his gray-headed youth. This study presents an argument for the importance of Poe's poetry as such. Thank you, bookmark, or book holder. Making the argument will require that we clarify the relation that issues of cultural significance have to issues of language and poetics. The methodology is thus ultimately philological, a critical dimension where close linguistic questions are studied in the context of material and especially documentary culture. In that perspective, Poe's Marginalia seems to me the theoretical center of Poe's work. I'm going to go shut my window because creeps could be out there. Marginalia, November 1844. In getting my books, I have been always solicitous of an ample margin, this not so much through any love of the thing in itself, however agreeable, as for the facility it affords me of penciling suggested thoughts, agreements, and differences of opinion, or brief critical comments in general. Where what I have to note is too much to be included within the narrow limits of a margin, I commit it to a slip of paper and deposit it between the leaves, taking care to secure it by an imperceptible portion of gum tragacanth paste. All this may be whim. It may be not only a very hackneyed but a very idle practice. Yet I persist in it still, and it affords me pleasure, which is profit in despite of Mr. Bentham with Mr. Mill on his back. The making of notes, however, is by no means the making of mere memoranda, a custom which has its disadvantages beyond doubt. C'est que I'm not saying these French phrases, says Bernardin de Saint Pierre. Jerome, and in fact, if you wish to forget anything upon the spot, make a note that this thing is to be remembered. I don't understand these inserting of foreign phrases. But the purely marginal jottings done with no eye to the memorandum book have a distinct complexion, and not only a distinct purpose, but none at all. That is, this it is which imparts to them a value. They have a rank somewhat above the chance and desultory comments of literary chit-chat, for these latter are not unfrequently talk for talk's sake, hurried out of the mouth, while the marginalia are deliberately penciled, because the mind of the reader wishes to unburden itself of a thought, however flippant, however silly, however trivial, still a thought indeed, not merely a thing that might have been a thought in time and under more favorable circumstances. In the marginalia, too, we talk only to ourselves. We therefore talk freshly, boldly, originally, with abandonment, without conceit, much after the fashion of Jeremy Taylor and Sir Thomas Browne and Sir William Temple and the anatomical Burton and the most logical analogist Butler and some other people of the old day who were too full of their matter to have any room for their manner. which, being thus left out of question, was a capital manner, indeed, a model of manners with a richly marginalic air. The circumscription of space, too, in these pencilings, has in it something more of advantage than of inconvenience. It compels us, whatever diffuseness of ideas we may clandestinely entertain, into Montesquieuism, into Tacitusism, here including portions, or even into Carlyleism, a thing which I have been told is not to be confounded with your ordinary affectation and bad grammar. I say bad grammar, though sheer obstinacy, because the grammarians who should know better insist upon it, and I should not. But then grammar is not what these grammarians will have it. And being merely the analysis of language with the result of this analysis, must be good or bad, just as the analyst is sage or silly, such as he is a horn, took, or a cobbet. But to our sheep, during a rainy afternoon not long ago, being in a mood too listless for continuous study, I sought relief from ennui in dipping here and there at random among the volumes of my library. No very large one, certainly, but sufficiently miscellaneous, and I flatter myself not a little what's that, research. I know that word, I just can't say it. Perhaps it was what the Germans call the brain scattering humor of the moment, but while the picturesqueness of the numerous pencil scratches arrested my attention, their helter-skelteriness of commentary amused me. I found myself at length forming a wish that it had been some other hand than my own which had so bedeviled the books, and fancying that in such case I might have derived no inconsiderable pleasure from turning them over. From this, the transition thought, as Mr. Lyell or Mr. Murchison or Mr. Featherstone would have it, was natural enough. There might be something even in my scribblings, which, for the mere sake of scribbling, would have interest for others. The main difficulty respected the mode of transferring the notes from the volumes, the context from the text, without the detriment to the exceedingly frail fabric of intelligibility in which the context was embedded. With all appliances to boot, with the printed pages at their back, the commentaries were too often like the Dodana's oracles, or those of Lycophron Tenebris's, or the essays of the pedant's pupils in Quintilian, which were necessarily excellent, since even he, the pedant, found it impossible to comprehend them. What then would become of it, this context, if transferred, if translated? Would it not rather be traduced, which is the French synonym or overzezet turned topsy-turvy, which is the Dutch one? I concluded at length to put extensive faith in the acumen and imagination of the reader. This is a general rule, but in some instances where even faith would not remove mountains, there seemed no safer plan than so to remodel the note as to convey at least the ghost of a conception as to what it was all about, where for such conception the text itself was absolutely necessary. I could quote it where the title of the book commented upon was indispensable. I could name it. In short, like a novel hero dilemmaed, I made a guided by circumstances in default of more satisfactory conduct. As for the multitudinous opinion expressed in the subjoined farrago, as for my present assent to all or dissent from any portion of it, as to the possibility of my having, in some instances, altered my mind, or as to the impossibility of my not having altered it often, these are points upon which I say nothing because upon these there can be nothing cleverly said. It may be as well to observe, however, that just as the goodness of your true pun is in the direct ratio of its intolerability, so is nonsense the essential sense of the marginal note. This, Poe's first marginalium, gives his theoretical justification for the general marginalian undertaking. At its core is one of those small and seriously provoking textual events. Distinguishing marginalia from memoranda, Poe takes up the former because they have not only a distinct purpose, but none at all. This it is that imports to them a value. He goes on to explain the value of their purposeless purpose by making another distinction between marginalia and literary chit-chat. The latter is a form of talk for talk's sake, whereas with the marginalium, the mind of the reader wishes to unburthen itself of a thought. Poe, the writer of this marginalium, exposes the fact that writers are always also readers, and reciprocally, the readers are always rewriting what they read. And in that event, readers have been provoked to expose themselves, their thinking to themselves. The view of the textual event is perhaps the most fundamental nexus for all of Poe's work. Furthermore, the term unburthen echoes back to Poe's remark that the profit in writing marginalia is a function of the pleasure it gives to hell with Mill and Bentham. Poe is commenting on the experience of intellectual surprise that marginalia afford. The reader turned spontaneous writer and talking only to himself is able to set his thought apart from his act of thinking. He can see it in the objectified context of the physical book that carries it. Did Poe actually inscribe his books with marginalia? We don't know, and probably never will. His library is lost, but the loss helps to clarify the theoretical significance of the marginalia, for this initial foray shows that marginalia for Poe are an imaginative construction, a kind of theory of marginalia. But I say a kind of theory because his account does not represent itself as a theory, but as a material and factual demonstration. He produces a set of marginalia and then has them printed and distributed. The situation calls attention to another distinctive feature of his work in general, its performance address. The context of his work is regularly made such a codependent function of its form that the two could not easily be prized apart. Poe's marginal reflection on marginalia, then naturally moves to the question of that objective medium, which he is now able to see in the more comprehensive reader perspective of the readers of his marginalia. The context of the marginalium is crucial and must somehow be preserved, since it gives an actual frame to the reading situation. But we now see that the context has a doubled and dialectical shape. Something of the initial writing condition must be materially remodeled for the benefit of the acumen and imagination of the reader who is reading the marginalium of the initial reader-writer. The model of marginalia is a form designed to accommodate multitudinous opinion. In the first instance, Poe's own; in the second and correspondent instances, the reader's. The echo of the certainty that Poe's thoughts are open to circumstantial shifts is the equivalent, certainly, that readers of the marginalia will be left to their own free thoughts. Poe embarks on marginalia with the purpose of engaging those free thoughts, his own and his readers'. The nonsense he speaks at the end of the nonsense he speaks of at the end is the vertiginous prospect of a cascading fall of marginalia. A fall not unlike the fall of the cascading, dash-driven parataxis that can and will project his energetic prose into a poetical dimension, as in Eureka. From Poe's review of Hazlitt's characters, of Shakespeare, the Broadway Journal, August 16th, 1845. In all commentating upon Shakespeare, there has been a radical error never yet mentioned. It is the error of attempting to expound his characters, to account for their actions, to reconcile his inconsistencies, not as if they were the coinage of a human brain, but as if they had been actual existences upon earth. We talk of Hamlet the man instead of Hamlet the dramatis persona, of Hamlet that God in place of Hamlet that Shakespeare created. If Hamlet had really lived, and if the tragedy were an accurate record of his deeds, from this record, with some trouble, we might, it is true, reconcile his inconsistencies and settle to our satisfaction his true character. But the task becomes the purest absurdity when we deal only with a phantom. It is not, then, the inconsistencies of the acting man which we have as a subject of discussion, although we proceed as if it were, and thus inevitably err, but the whims and vacillations, the conflicting energies and indolences of the poet. It seems to us little less than a miracle that this obvious point should have been overlooked. While on this topic, we may as well offer an ill-considered opinion of our own as to the intention of the poet in the delineation of the Dane. It must have been well known to Shakespeare that a leading feature in certain more intense classes of intoxication, from whatever cause, is an almost irresistible impulse to counterfeit a farther degree of excitement than actually exists. Analogy would lead any thoughtful person to suspect the same impulse in madness, where beyond doubt it is manifest. This Shakespeare felt, not thought. He felt it through his marvelous power of identification with humanity at large, the ultimate source of his magical influence upon mankind. He wrote of Hamlet as if Hamlet he were, and having in the first instance imagined his hero excited to partial insanity by the disclosures of the ghost, he, the poet, felt that it was natural he should be impelled to exaggerate the insanity. The corpus of Poe's literary reviews is extensive and famous for infamous, both for the severity of his judgments and the idiosyncrasy of his interests and literary preferences. Not often enough remarked is the theoretical relation of the reviews to the marginalia. It is well known that equivalent and even verbatim passages appear in both the marginalia and Poe's various reviews, essays, and letters. The critical reflections at the heart of the Hazlitt Review, however, has no equivalent text in the marginalia. Nonetheless, the Hazlitt Review is striking because it is far less a review of Hazlitt's book than an extended marginalium provoked by Poe's reading of Hazlitt's book, provoked to a reading of Shakespeare, and thus provoked to a more general reflection on how poetry works. Poe's commentary begins as a book review, but after its initial paragraph, it clearly shifts into a pair of related reflections on poetry, using Shakespeare and Hamlet as his exempla. In the first, he argues that we miss the poetical importance of Shakespeare if we read his plays, their actions and characters, as if they everything as the coinage of a human brain. The case of Hamlet's inconsistency should not be approached through an appeal to realist criteria of verisimilitude. Rather, they reflect the conflicting energies and indolences of the poet. The text of the play is a map of the creative mind, a representation of what Keats called the wreathed trellis of a working brain, ode to Psyche. Such a view could well has licensed, biographical readings of Shakespeare's plays. Poe's commentary is not arguing for such approaches, however, although it is equally true that he would not discountenance them if they were to flaunt their speculative status. His commentary is primarily designed to expose how a complex human being or action gets investigated in a poetical field. Taking Hamlet as a paradigm case of a character deranged from common understanding, his own and ours alike, Poe argues that understanding can be promoted by creating further counterfeit forms of derangement, what Eliot would later call objective cor- correlatives, can't say it, correlatives, by which to reflect on the initial obscurity. Hamlet and Hamlet unfold themselves in their further counterfeit forms. The play Hamlet is therefore the dramatic staging of a process of poetic revelation. It is only figuratively a play about a verisimilar, how do you say verisimilitude? Verisimilar man in extremis, tangled in a fear and guilt ridden world. Shakespeare fashions Hamlet's intense intoxication and insanity, nor to reflect the condition of Hamlet and his world, or even to lift both from their mystified condition. While those representations do transpire, they come as counterfeit images of poetic imagination in action, which itself works by counterfeit images. Because the results of Hamlet's counterfeit theatricals are uniformly terrible, however, a sinister irony haunts Poe's interpretation of the imagination's marvelous power of identification with humanity at large. The irony infects Poe's commentary when he remarks on the conflicting energies and indolences of the poet, who is, it seems, with all his gifts, and unredemptive and unredeemed as the beings with whom, by poetical means, he sympathizes and identifies. From Poe's review of Longfellow's Ballad and Other Poems, Graham's Magazine, April 1842. In our last number, we had some hasty observations on these ballads, observations which we now propose to amplify and explain. It may be remembered that among other points, we demurred to Mr. Longfellow's themes, or rather to their general character. We found fault with the too obtrusive nature of their didacticism. Some years ago, we urged the similar objection to one or two of the longer pieces of Bryant, and neither time nor reflection has sufficed to modify in the slightest particular our convictions upon this topic. We have said that Mr. Longfellow's conception of the aims of poesy is erroneous, and that thus, laboring at a disadvantage, he does violent wrong to his own high powers. And now the question is, what are his ideas of the aims of the muse? As we gather these ideas from the general tendency of his poems, it will be at once evident that, imbued with the peculiar spirit of German song, a pure conventionality, he regards the inculcation of a moral as essential. Here we find it necessary to repeat that we have reference only to the general tendency of his compositions, for there are some magnificent exceptions where, as if by accident, he has permitted his genius to get the better of his conventional prejudice. But didacticism is the prevalent tone of his song. His invention, his imagery, his all is made subservient to the elucidation of some one or more points, but rarely or more than one, of more than one, which he looks upon as truth, and that this mode of procedure will find stern defenders should never excite surprise, so long as the world is full to overflowing with cant and conventicles. There are men who will scramble on all fours through the muddiest sloughs of vice to pick up a single apple of virtue. There are things called men who, so long as the sun rolls, will greet with snuffing huzzas every figure that takes upon itself the semblance of truth, even although the figure in itself only a stuffed paddy be as much out of place as a toga on the statue of Washington, or out of season as rabbits in the days of the dog star. Now, with a deep reverence for the true, as ever inspired the bosom of mortal man, we would limit in many respects its modes of inculcation. We would limit to enforce them. We would not render them impotent by dissipation. The demands of truth are severe. She has no sympathy with the myrtles. All that is indispensable in song is all with which she has nothing to do. To deck her in gay robes is to render her a harlot. It is but making her a flaunting paradox to wreathe her in gems and flowers. Even in stating this, our purest proposition, we verify our own words. We feel the necessity in enforcing this truth of descending from metaphor. Let us then be simple and distinct. To convey the true, we are required to dismiss from the attention all inessentials. We must be perspicuous, precise, terse. We need concentration rather than expansion of mind. We must be calm, unimpassioned, unexcited. In a word, we must be in that peculiar mood, which, as nearly as possible, is the exact converse of the poetical. He must be blind indeed who cannot perceive the radical and chasmal difference between the truthful and the poetical modes of inculcation. He must be grossly wedded to conventionalisms, who, in spite of this difference, shall still attempt to reconcile the obstinate oils and waters of poetry and truth. Dividing the world of mind into its most obvious and immediate recognizable distinctions, we have the pure intellect, taste, and the moral sense. We place taste between the intellect and the moral sense because it is just this intermediate space which in the mind it occupies. It is the connecting link in the triple chain. It serves to sustain a mutual intelligence between the extremes. It appertains in strict appreciation to the former, but is distinguished from the latter by so faint a difference that Aristotle has not hesitated to class some of its operations among the virtues themselves. But the offices of the trio are broadly marked, just as conscience or morals, the moral sense, recognizes duty, just as the intellect deals with truth, so it is the part of taste alone to inform us of beauty. And poesy is the handmaiden but of taste. Yet we would not be misunderstood. This handmaiden is not forbidden to moralize in her own fashion. She is not forbidden to depict, but to reason and preach of virtue, as of this latter conscience recognizes the obligation. So intellect teaches the expediency, while taste contents herself with displaying the beauty. Waging war with vice merely on the ground of its inconsistency with fitness, harmony, proportion, in a word, with some Greek shit I don't know. An important condition of man's immortal nature is thus, plainly, the sense of the beautiful. This it is which ministers to his delight in the manifold forms, and colors and sounds and sentiments amid which he exists, and just as the eyes of Amaryllis are repeated in the mirror, or the living lily in the lake, so is the mere record of these forms and colors and sounds and sentiments. So is their mere oral or written repetition a duplicate source of delight. But this repetition is not poesy. He who shall merely sing with whatever rapture in however harmonious strains, or which however vivid a truth of imitation of the sights and sounds which greet him in common with all mankind, he, we say, has yet failed to prove his divine title. There is still a longing unsatisfied which he has been impotent to fulfill. There is still a thirst unquenchable which to allay he has shown us no crystal springs. This burning thirst belongs to the immortal essence of man's nature. It is equally a consequence and an indication of his perennial life. It is the desire of the moth for the star. It is not the mere appreciation of the beauty before us. It is a wild effort to reach the beauty above. It is a forethought of the loveliness to come. It is a passion to be satiated by no sublunary sights or sounds or sentiments, and the soul, thus athirst, strives to allay its fever in futile efforts at creation. Inspired with the prescient ecstasy of the beauty beyond the grave, it struggles by multiform novelty of combination among the things and thoughts of time to anticipate some portion of that loveliness whose very elements perhaps appertain solely to eternity. And the result of such effort on the part of souls fittingly constituted is alone what mankind have agreed to denominate poetry. We say this with little fear of contradiction, yet the spirit of our assertion must be more heated than the letter. Mankind have seemed to define poesy in 1,000 and in 1,000 contradicting definitions. But the war is only one, but the war is one only of words. Induction is as well applicable to this subject as to the most palpable and utilitarian and by its sober processes. We find that in respect to compositions which have been really received as poems, the imaginative, or more popularly, the creative portions alone have ensured them to be so received. Yet these works, on account of these portions, having once been so received and so named, it has happened naturally and inevitably that other portions, totally unpoetic, have not only come to be regarded by the popular voice as poetic, but have been made to serve as false standards of perfection in the adjustment of other poetical claims. Whatever has been found and whatever has been received as a poem has been blindly regarded as ex statu poetic, and this is a species of gross error which scarcely could have made its way into any less intangible topic. In fact, that license which appertains to the muse herself, it has been thought decorous, if not sagacious, to indulge in all examination of her character. Poesy is thus seen to be a response, unsatisfactory, it is true, but still in some measure a response to a natural and irrepressible demand. Man being what he is, the time could never have been in which poesy was not. Man being what he is, the time could never have been in which poesy was not. Its first element is the thirst for supernal beauty, a beauty which is not afforded the soul by any existing collocation of earth's forms, a beauty which perhaps no possible combination of these forms would fully produce. Its second element is the attempt to satisfy this thirst by novel combinations among those forms of beauty which already exist, or by novel combinations of those combinations which our predecessors, toiling in chase of the same phantom, have already set in order. We thus clearly deduce the novelty, the originality, the invention, the imagination, or lastly, the creation of beauty. For the terms as here employed are synonymous as the essence of all poesy, nor is this idea so much at variance with ordinary opinion as, at first sight, it may appear. A multitude of antique dogmas on this topic will be found when divested of extrinsic speculation, to be easily resoluble into the definition now proposed. We do nothing more than present tangibly the vague clouds of the world's idea, We recognize the idea itself floating, unsettled, indefinite in every attempt which has yet been made to circumscribe the conception of poesy in words. A striking instance of this is observable in the fact that no definition exists in which either the beautiful or some one of those qualities which we have above designated synonymously sick with creation has not been pointed out as the chief attribute of the muse. Invention, however, or imagination is by far more commonly insisted upon. The word, and if anyone knows Greek, I believe that is, let me know. The word itself, creation, speaks volumes upon this point. Neither will it be amiss here to mention Count Byfield's definition of poetry as whatever this French sentence is, with this definition of which the philosophy is profound to a certain extent. The German terms Dichtkunst, the art of fiction, and Dichten, to feign, which are used for poetry and to make verses, are in full and remarkable accordance. It is nevertheless in the combination of the two omniprevalent ideas that the novelty, and we believe the force of our own propositions, is to be found. So far, we have spoken of poesy as an abstraction alone. As such, it is obvious that it may be applicable in various moods. The sentiment may develop itself as sculpture, in painting, in music, or otherwise, but our present business is with its development in words, that development to which, in practical acceptation, the world has agreed to limit the term. And at this point, there is one consideration which induces us to pause. We cannot make up our minds to admit, as some have admitted, the inessentiality of rhythm. On the contrary, the universality of its use in the earliest poetical efforts of all mankind would be sufficient to assure us not merely of its congeniality with the muse or of its adaptation to her purposes, but of its elementary and indispensable importance. But here we must, perforce, content ourselves with mere suggestion, for this topic is of a character which would lead us too far. We have already spoken of music, as one of the moods of poetical development. It is in music, perhaps, that the soul most nearly attains that end upon which we have commented, the creation of supernal beauty. It may be indeed that this august aim is here even partially or imperfectly attained. In fact, the elements of that beauty which is felt in sound may be the mutual or common heritage of earth and heaven. In the soul struggles at combination, it is thus not impossible that a harp may strike notes not unfamiliar to the angels. And in this view, the wonder may well be less that all attempts at defining the character or sentiment of the deeper musical impressions has been found absolutely futile. Contenting ourselves, therefore, with the firm conviction that music, in its modifications of rhythm and rhyme, is of so vast a moment in poesy as never to be neglected by him who is truly poetical, is of so mighty a force in furthering the great aim intended that he is mad who rejects its assistance. Content with this idea, we shall not pause to maintain its absolute essentiality. For the mere sake of rounding a definition, we will but add at this point that the highest possible development of the poetical sentiment is to be found in the union of song with music in its popular sense. The old bards and minnesingers possessed in the fullest perfection the finest and truest elements of poesy, and Thomas Moore, singing his own ballads, is but putting the final touch to their completion as poems. To recapitulate, then, we would define in brief the poetry of words as the rhythmical creation of beauty. Beyond the limits of beauty, its province does not extend. Its sole arbiter is taste. With the intellect or with the conscience, it has only collateral relations. It has no dependence, unless incidentally upon either duty or truth, that our definition will necessarily exclude much of what, through a supine toleration, has been hitherto ranked as poetical, is a matter which affords us not even momentary concern. We address but the thoughtful and heed only their approval. With our own, if our suggestions are truthful, then after many days shall they be understood as truth, even though found in contradiction of all that has been hitherto so understood. If false, shall we not be the first to bid them die? Jesus Christ. The pertinent section of this document, which is the second installment of Poe's review of Longfellow's 1841 volume, comes in these opening 10 paragraphs, where he gives an extended explanation of his poetics. That is to say, both his theory of poetry and his views of how it works. The two subjects are for him not only closely related, they are reciprocal. The idea of poetry, its conceptual basis, is not adequately conceivable except as a poetic execution. In this sense, the subject of Poe's poetry is always finally the idea of poetry itself, and that idea is only to be realized performatively. Archibald MacLeish's well-known remark, "Itself a poetical performative," is very much to the point. A poem should not mean but be. The opening paragraphs argue two key points: that the expression of particular ideas, what Poe called the didactic heresy, is not the object of poetry and should not be a poet's intention, as it is, Poe avers, Longfellow's, and that reciprocally, the rhythmical creation of beauty is both the poetical object and the poet's intention. A poem thus becomes an object, held in view as a problem of how to make the object, understanding the object as a social nexus, an object for an audience. The idea of the poem is its execution, a procedural event fashioned by the poet for a reader's sentimental, affective response and experience. Given that understanding, Poe has great difficulty explaining himself in expository prose. These paragraphs are therefore important as a forecast of all the many later prose passages where Poe keeps returning to these same subjects in the marginalia, in the letters and reviews, most particularly in his three celebrated essays on poetry and poetics, which I shall later be examining in detail. Those expository adventures culminate in Eureka, where Poe finally discovers a method of strictly poetic exposition, as his subtitle to that work, a prose poem, tells us. The method draws upon what he learned about writing prose as a magazinist, performer, fiction, nonfiction, and hoax. These paragraphs also look back to Poe's 1831 letter to the introduction to his 1831 volume Poems, where Poe made his first extended effort to lay out his views. The culminant paragraph of that somewhat desultory text is particularly relevant here. A poem, in my opinion, is opposed to a work of science by having for its immediate object pleasure, not truth, to romance by having for its object an indefinite instead of a definite pleasure, being a poem only so far as this object is attained, romance presenting perceptible images with definite, poetry with indefinite sensations, to which end music is an essential, since the comprehension of sweet sound is our most indefinite conception. Music, when combined with a pleasurable idea, is poetry. Music without the idea is simply music. The idea without the music is prose from its very definiteness. Paragraph 21. In his various comments and discussions, certain distinctions and critical terms recur. Most important is the relation of poetry to music, and the indefinite pleasure this music-based view of poetry produces. Here and in all the associated documents, Poe insists on the intellectual character of poetic music. It registers as a conception very particular in its material expression, but indefinite in the effect it produces in the reader, as all of Poe's many discussions of poetry and poetics insist. Moreover, by music, Poe means the network of sweet sounds that organize the poetical work. Observe that Poe does not say ideas when combined with pleasurable music is poetry, but rather the reverse. Music, when combined with ideas, is poetry. Poe gives the musical resources of a poem intellectual primacy and makes everything else its semantic features, most of all, functions of the music. A passage in the Marginalia of April 1849 is also relevant here, discussing the suggestive indefinitiveness of poetical sentiment. Poe says that it is a function of the conception of sweet sounds simply because the acoustic harmonics of poetry have a conceptual character which is for Poe even more intellectual, in Shelley's sense, than the concepts of reason or philosophy. Nor is the term music loosely deployed if, as he argues in his Longfellow review, the first element of poetry is the thirst for supernal beauty. Its second element is the attempt to satisfy this thirst by novel combinations of those forms of beauty which already exist, or by novel combinations of combinations which our predecessors have already set in order. The reference is to the acoustic elements of language as they develop through phonemes, syllables, words, phrasal, and syntactic units, as well as the host of second-order combinations that have been built from those elements by the company of earlier writers and poets. Poe insists on the primacy of music rather than concept or idea in order to protect the poetical event from the expository inertia of language itself, which would channel the material resources of language into the abstract regions of what he calls truth. When he plundered his 1842 Longfellow Review for the central section of his essay, The Poetic Principle, written sometime in 1848, various changes came in, and none more significant than his treatment of the key terms, truth, passion, and beauty. In 1842, the great threat to poetical expression comes from the didactic heresy, and while Poe is careful to argue that poetry is not forbidden to depict moral or intellectual ideas, he insists that they be handled formally as elements contributing to the harmony of the composition. Passion, however, remains as a feature of the poet's wild effort to reach the beauty above. A passion, Poe adds, to be satiated by no sublunary sights or sounds or sentiments, and supernal beauty, though the focus of poetical desire, is inaccessible except as the experience of its failed achievement. By late 1844, Poe is rethinking the question of poetry and passion, varying sharply from the Longfellow Review, where he says that a calm, unimpassioned address is the exact converse of the poetical. He now avers that poetry and passion are discordant. Marginalia, December 1844. The move comes in the discussion of Amelia Welby's poem, The Departed. Welby's work, Poe argues, is among the class passionate, as Longfellow's, some magnificent exceptions aside, is among the class didactic. True passion is prosaic, homely. Any strong mental emotion stimulates all the mental faculties, thus grief, the imagination. But in proportion as the effect is strengthened, the cause surceases. The excited fancy triumphs, the grief is subdued, chastened, is no longer grief. In this mood we are poetic, and it is clear that a poem now written will be poetic in the exact ratio of its dispassion. A passionate poem is a contradiction in terms. When I say, then, that Miss Welby's stanzas are good among the class passionate, using the term commonly and falsely applied, I mean that her tone is properly subdued. Though directed at a specifically elegiac poem, the argument relates to the larger aesthetic question of satiating poetry's representation of supernal desires with an order where the desire is experienced, but its satisfaction is impossible. Poe seems to have become especially interested in the contradiction the month before, as the following marginalium shows. When music affects us to tears, seemingly causeless, we weep not, as Gravina supposes, from excesses of pleasure, but through excess of an impatient, petulant sorrow, that as mere mortals we are as yet in no condition to banquet upon those supernal ecstasies of which the music affords us merely a suggestive and indefinite glimpse. In the 1842 Longfellow Review, that thought was not part of Poe's discussion of poetry as the desire of the moth for the star, but in 1848 it culminates that celebrated passage from the Poetic Principle. In November and December 1844, Poe was working to explain how the dynamic of poetic dispassion operates. The poetic onset of homely passion, impatient, petulant sorrow, stimulates all the mental faculties, so that the excited fancy triumphs and grief is subdued, chastened. The result is a poetry that reflects in sublunary terms what we may imagine as the perfect harmony of eternity. For Poe, Mrs. Welby's poem, The Departed, is elegiac, and he instances his own poem, Lenore, as an equivalent work. That he chooses to cite that poem as elegiac rather than say, The Conqueror Worm draws an important, if implicit, distinction. I mean, he might have just been drunk, too. Poe's late 1844 reconsideration of the issue of poetic passion eventually appears when he recasts the 1842 Longfellow Review passage in The Poetic Principle, 1848. The difference between the equivalent 1844 and 1848 passages speaks for itself. Maybe I'll read to page 42. Might as well. It'll end on that section then. 1842. There is still a longing unsatisfied which he has been impotent to fulfill. There is still a thirst unquenchable which to allay he has shown us no crystal springs. This burning thirst belongs to the immortal essence of man's nature. It is equally a consequence and an indication of his perennial life. It is the desire of the moth for the star. It is not the mere appreciation of the beauty before us. It is a wild effort to reach the beauty above. It is a forethought of the loveliness to come. It is a passion to be satiated by no sublunary sights or sounds or sentiments, and the soul thus athirst strives to allay its fever in futile efforts at creation. Inspired with the prescient ecstasy of the beauty beyond the grave, it struggles by multiform novelty of combinations among the things and thoughts of time to anticipate some portion of that loveliness whose very elements perhaps appertain solely to eternity. And the result of such effort on the parts of souls fittingly constituted, is alone what mankind have agreed to denominate poetry. 1848. We have still a thirst unquenchable, to allay which he has not shown us the crystal springs. The thirst belongs to the immortality of man. It is at once a consequence and an indication of his perennial existence. It is the desire of the moth for the star. It is no mere appreciation of the beauty before us, but a wild effort to reach the beauty above. Inspired by an ecstatic prescience of the glories beyond the grave, we struggle by multiform combinations among the things and thoughts of time to attain a portion of that loveliness whose very elements perhaps appertain to eternity alone. And thus, when by poetry or when by music, the most entrancing of the poetic moods, we find ourselves melted into tears. We weep then, not as the Abate Gravina supposes, through excess of pleasure, but through a certain petulant, impatient sorrow at our inability to grasp now, wholly here on earth, at once and forever, those divine and rapturous joys of which, through the poem or through the music, we attain to but brief and indeterminate glimpses. No passage in Poe exposes in a more striking way his departure from certain acknowledged premises of romantic imagination. Poe has left far behind Keats's Shakespearean dream of negative capability, Coleridge's idea of poetic balance and reconciliation, Wordsworth's experience of being laid asleep in body to become a living soul, Byron's Promethean translation of romantic desire. Instead, he takes as his point of departure the self deprecating reflection on human love in Shelley's diminished lyric, too. One word is too often profaned. Shelley had recovered a celebrated figure in Eastern poetry, the desire of the moth for the flame, but entirely altered its valence by changing the word flame to star. Forced to assume a Faustian inflection, the eros of personal love mutates to a figure of estrangement. Love becomes a little boy lost in cosmic translation. I can give not what men call love, but will thou accept not. The worship the heart lifts above, and the heavens reject not. The desire of the moth for the star, of the night for the morrow, the devotion to something afar from the sphere of our sorrow. Shelley's poem sustains a romantic sublime through a striking seizure of affective diminishment, one of his most characteristic poetic moves. Paradoxically, the cosmic orientation that gets fixed in the final two lines emerges from Shelley's initial gesture of self-deprecation. But when Poe resumes Shelley's figuration, he turns the screw on the idea of an impossible pursuit of creative perfection. The terms petulant and impatient sink Shelley's devotional gesture to a figure of ordinary, even infantile frustration. Something perverse and fractious is more deeply interfused with this poet's life than a capable imagination. The passage thus executes a negative transfiguration of the figure of the poet, a move that may recall for us as it anticipates in time both Nietzsche and Rimbaud, like Nietzsche in Human, All Too Human, 1878, where he forswore his allegiance to the Wagnerian idea of poetic genius. Poe represented poetic achievement as poetic craftsmanship. That commitment is most elaborately made in his essays, The Philosophy of Composition and The Rationale of Verse. Here we see how and why that position is peculiarly cherished, because Poe disallows the Shelleyan premise of poetic inspiration. The poet's limited capabilities are taken for granted. In that respect, we also appreciate why the Rimbaud connection is even closer and more important. For Poe's commentary forces us to consider poets as balked and willful children rather than as pilgrims of eternity. Like Rimbaud, Poe's startling words link the practice of ecstatic poetry, the pursuit of supernal beauty, to the acres hypocrisies of Liam Deun Enfant, blah, blah, I don't know. Oh, repugnances, les poetes des sept anges, the bitter hypocrisies in the soul of a child delivered up to contempt. We are arrested at this shameless image of a poet of manifestly incapable imagination who then sets his cross and captious attitude as the sign of his poetic vocation. One last change Poe made in 1848 is also important. In 1842, he allows that poetry may introduce moral ideas so long as they are handled incidentally, by which he means as formal elements within the poem's commitment to musical harmony, proportion, but he makes no exception for poetry of the class passionate. The exception is removed in 1848. The incitements of passion, or the precepts of duty, or even the lessons of truth may be introduced into a poem, and with advantage, for they may subserve incidentally in various ways the general purposes of the work. But the true artist will always contrive to tone them down in proper subjection to that beauty, which is the atmosphere and the real essence of the poem. And that's going to be all for now because I've read for about an hour and 13 minutes. We are done. How many more pages in this chapter? I think quite a bit, isn't there? Yeah, quite a bit. Come on, man. Yeah. 69, so what's that leave? 26 pages. How many have I read in this first chapter? That's 29 pages, so yeah. Another hour or so away. There we go. Not a bad book. A lot of the stuff is unfamiliar, but some of it is very familiar. Let's see what this is. Tape. See if I can get this tape off without being sticky as fuck. What do you think, bro? Is it going to be sticky under there? No. It is not. Nor there. All right. That's all, bruv.